Hello, and thanks for attending this talk. My name is Johannes H, and I'll be talking about effective strategies for visualizing multivariate spatial and spatio-temporal data. Maybe before we get started, I'll introduce myself a little bit. So I'm originally trained as a land surveying and geomatics engineer, graduated from Karlsruhe University of Applied Sciences in Germany, and later I did my PhD in geographic information science at CU Boulder in the geography department, and have then been working as a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute of Behavioral Science and CIRES, both at CU Boulder. My research interests are long-term urbanization and settlement dynamics, historical geospatial data curation and analysis, uncertainty quantification in spatial data, as well as data visualization in general. So I use different kinds of data, such as remote sensing data, but also historical maps, large property and cadastral databases, building footprint data, road network data, things like that. This is a word cloud that I generated based on the abstracts of my publications. So just to give you a little bit of an idea where I come from in terms of research interests. So you see the word data, historical map, settlement, urbanization, things like that. So yeah, just to give you kind of a little bit of context. Okay, so the agenda for today. I'm planning to talk about 4 topics. Visualizing spatio-temporal trends in data, visualizing multivariate time series, spatializing ternary plots, and some animated data visualization. Each of these 4 topics will be exemplified with ongoing and past research projects that I've been working on. So I hope this will be interesting. And let's start with the first topic, visualizing spatio-temporal trends in data, COVID-19 trends across the rural-urban continuum. So the research question here is to basically analyze and visualize how COVID infection rates have varied over time and across the rural-urban continuum. And I'll explain in a bit what we mean by that actually. So the data sources that I used here are the COVID-19 cases that are available per county for each week in the US and also in other countries such as Germany. I use county boundaries, and then I also use a remote sensing data product, which is the global human settlement layer that contains information on how rural or how urban a specific place is. We've all seen these maps more than enough probably over the last couple of years. So what you see here are basically a set of choropleth maps that show the weekly cases of COVID infections per 100,000 people. So it's basically the infection density, if you will, per population. So this is just a very standard way to visualize that, right? And of course you can see some trends, but in particular, if we were interested in visualizing, analyzing how COVID spread from rural to urban areas or vice versa, we can't really get that information from these visualizations. So what you can see to the left is basically a schematic or illustration of the underlying data. So we have the county ID, we have the date, and we have the number of cases, right? So for each county and for each date, we have the number of cases and can generate these choropleth maps just using GeoPandas in this case. So it's all done in Python. What we do, we're interested in looking at how COVID has spread, from rural to urban or vice versa. So the first thing that we did was to actually model the so-called rural-urban continuum, right? So it's based on the assumption that there are very rural places and there are very urban, highly urban places, and then there is something in between, and in between is kind of a gradual transition from rural into urban. And there are different ways how to measure and model that. And what we do, we use this remote sensing based data product, which is the GHSL settlement model, or SMOD, which is a data product that contains several classes of rural-urban classification based on population density, and settlement density, and also settlement morphology. And what we did, we turned this into a continuous measure of urbanness for each county. And this is basically what we see in this choropleth map here. So yeah, blue would be most rural and red would be the most urban. I also want you to critically look at the color schemes that I used. Some of the visualizations were done a few years ago, not paying attention so much to the chosen colors. So there might be ways to visualize this in a better manner by choosing a different color scheme. So this is a diverging color scheme. I'm not sure if I would use it nowadays. We would generally use this for a kind of a signed process, right? That has like negative and positive numbers. But my criterion to choose this was basically, it looks nice, so it's visually appealing, plus it shows the variation. So these are basically the main criteria that I have when I pick a color scheme. Okay, so what you can see here in this map, you see, the transition from rural into urban. So with states like Nevada and also here the Dakotas being very rural, and then of course highly urban regions or counties here in the east and northeast. You can also see the Front Range here. Okay, so we have this measure of urbanness on a continuous scale from 0 to 100 for each county. Now, if we want to visualize how COVID spread over time, and at the same time how it spread across this rural-urban continuum, what we do, we kind of span a three-dimensional space where the three dimensions are time, urbanness, and then the number of cases as the third dimension. So we group counties into classes of urbanness and aggregate the cases for each point in time and for each urbanness class or urbanness stratum. And we can then visualize this in a heat map. So I think this is quite interesting to look at, because it's a kind of an aspatial way to visualize geographic space and time at the same time, right? So we have on the y-axis from top to bottom time, so starting in March 2020, to January 2021. And then on the x-axis, we have urbanness from rural to urban, right? And we do this in a comparative study for US and Germany, as you can see. So consistently in the same temporal bins and in the same strata or classes of urbanness. So the interesting thing here is that the intensity of the heat map, so basically the colors represent the number of cases, right? And you can see in the US, for example, that COVID started basically in urban areas, right? If I recall correctly, I think the first cases were registered in Seattle. So that's at the far right of the rural-urban continuum. It's a highly urban environment, right? But then a week later, there was probably an outbreak in a rather rural county, right? Which could be that is spatially close to Seattle or not. We don't see this from this map as we transform space into a linear dimension, right? Just reducing geographic space to its level of urbanness or rurality. So you can see that until May, basically, COVID was predominantly present in highly urban areas, and then it spread into rural parts of the country. And by November 2020, we had actually the highest infection rates in very, very rural parts of the country. And then again, towards the end of the year 2020 and early 2021, again, we had like the highest infection rate in rather urban environments, right? Now, if you compare this to the pattern that we observe in Germany, it actually started in a kind of mid-sized town during Carnival. I remember this quite well. And then it was spreading like in rural and urban places with a very similar intensity, right? And then infection rates went down towards, May 2020, and there were like occasional outbreaks in rural and semi-urban areas. And then again, towards the end of the study period here, we had, similar infection rates in urban and rural settings. So this is what these maps tell us. So I think it's an interesting example to transform geographic space into a linear dimension and spanning a three-dimensional space of time and this transformed geographic space, and then visualize some spatial process by means of the intensity of this heat map. So this is the first example that I'd like to talk about. Now we can go to the next slide. Yeah, looking at the second example, visualizing multivariate time series associated with geographic objects. An example from my work on long-term urbanization trends for US metropolitan areas. First, I should give you some context here. What is important to know is that if you're interested in assessing long-term landscape changes, you're often impeded by the lack of spatial data, right? So for the last 10 years, 20 years, there's a lot of data. We have remote sensing, we have digital cartography, there's a lot of data available, but if you go back in time, if you want to analyze cities in a GIS in the 1980s, 1970s, or even earlier, there is just no data, right? Because data was acquired not in digital manners. There was no operational remote sensing. There was no Landsat data archive and things like that that we could rely on, right? So if we want historical geospatial data, we need to rely on different data sources. And one of these data sources is property data, because property data often contains construction dates. So we get some information about, when a city was built, or in which time period a specific part or neighborhood of a city was built. And what we do here in this project, we use a US-wide property data set, which is ZTRAX, Zillow's Transaction and Assessment data set. It's an industry-fueled cadastral data harmonization project. So you probably know Zillow, which is a real estate company. So they are interested in property value and other characteristics of buildings. So they collected these data from cadastral data sources, and ZTRAX holds detailed information on around 150 million US properties, including the construction year. So since 2017, I guess, we have access to ZTRAX. It's not open data, but it's available to researchers via a data share agreement. And what we did, we used ZTRAX to generate these historical settlement data that we then published, which is called HISDAC US, or Historical Settlement Data Compilation for the United States. And one of the spatial layers from this HISDAC US data set is this first build up layer. So it's a gridded data set, so a raster data set that visualizes the settlement age at each grid cell, basically by mapping the earliest construction date of the buildings within each grid cell. And we did this for the whole country. So you can nicely see settlement patterns over the long term here. In yellow, in green and yellow, you can see the oldest parts of the cities, and then how these cities have grown. Some remarks here on the color scheme. This is a pre-defined color scheme in an ArcMap. I used ArcMap for this. I see age here as a rather qualitative variable, even though it's of course quantitative variable, because it's measured by the minimum construction year per grid cell, right? But old and new, or old and young, can also be interpreted as qualitative measures rather than quantitative measures. So I think such a color scheme, going from transitioning from green into blue, can be used here, and it looks nice, I think. So that was the intuition here. Okay, so this is HISDAC US, this historical settlement data set that we've created. And we can not only visualize settlement age per grid cell, we can also use these data sets that we created to look at how cities have grown over time. Another interesting example here, what you can see here are basically 35 US cities. And I think an interesting detail here is that we arranged them in a quasi-geographic space, I would say. So the upper right corner is northeast, and the lower left corner is southwest. So I think this is a quite effective way to visualize city growth at a fine spatial grain. but for a range of different geographic objects, which are the cities here. So you can obviously see how the Northeast developed earlier, then the southern cities in Texas, etc., grew much later but much faster. An extreme example would be Las Vegas, that started to grow very, very late, but then expanded very, very fast. So maybe we can watch it once more. So Santa Fe was an early developed city because it was founded by Spanish settlers that came through Mexico, actually. So that's kind of an outlier down in the south. So yeah, I'll continue. All this material is actually online. You can watch it online. So what we did, we not just visualized urban growth for each city, we also want to conduct an multivariate analysis of long-term urban spatial trajectories of US metropolitan areas. Yeah, the animation here is a little bit messed up. So we can characterize cities by their size and by their form. And by size, we basically mean the actual extent, the density, and by form, we mean the shape, the spatial structure, and the morphology of the city. And based on the data that we've just seen, we're able to measure this. So we can derive size-related metrics for each MSA, so for each metropolitan statistical area, and for each point in time. At the same time, we can derive landscape metrics that measure form or the spatial structure of a landscape. We can also do this for each MSA and for each point in time. So we're able to generate a multivariate time series for each city. And this will help us to quantitatively assess how have cities changed over time with respect to size-related and form-related characteristics. And are these trajectories that cities take, are they similar or do they follow dissimilar patterns? So these are the research questions here. As an example, if we look at Atlanta in 1910, you can see there are all these tiny little villages in 1910, and now in 2010, it looks like this. Whereas the second example, Boulder, consisted just of a few tiny patches of built-up land in 1910, and nowadays there are many more of those patches. And third example, Ames, Iowa, the number of these patches of built-up land or contiguous areas of built-up land has stayed relatively stable. So the number of built-up patches is actually a shape-related measure of a city. And whether this number of patches decreases or increases over time tells us a lot about, you know, the settlement development over time. So this is an example of a form-related or shape-related measure. So yeah, for each MSA, for each metro area, we have a 10-dimensional time series. These 10 dimensions consist of 5 size-related metrics and 5 shape-related or form-related metrics, right? Size-related metrics are the number of buildings, the total building indoor area, the total developed area, built-up density, and also a measure of housing unit size. Shape or structure, form-related metrics, the number of patches, what we just seen in this example. Also a measure of scatteredness, the number of isolated, spatially isolated settlements, the area proportion of the largest patch, and then measures of compactness and clusteredness. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. So important to know here is that for each of the 300 metro areas, we have a time series that consists of 10 dimensions, right? And these 10 dimensions are the size and the shape related metrics. What we do here in this analysis, we actually do a dimensionality reduction and visualize trajectories in this kind of lower dimensional space, and then compare these trajectories. This is the methodology, but that's not too important because we want to focus on the actual visualization here. So if we look at the underlying data that we've generated, I want to illustrate this a little bit here in this table. So we see here the cities, so city A and city B, as an example of these 300 metro areas, 300 cities that we're analyzing. For each of the 300 cities, we have around 20 points in time, which is a measure for each year from 1910 to 2010 in 5 years intervals. And then for each city, for each year, we have these 5 size-related metrics, so the number of buildings, etc. At the same time, we have the 5 form-related metrics. So if you sum this up, you have 300 cities, 20 points in time, and 10 dimensions. So we have a total of 60,000 data points. And what we did, we used TSNE, which is a dimensionality reduction method. It stands for T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, which allows us to map these 5 dimensions into a 2-dimensional space while preserving the explanatory power of the input space to some extent. Yeah, that's maybe probably not the best way to explain it. It's yeah, really just a dimensionality reduction method, similar to principal components analysis. There are other methods. There is UMAP in machine learning jargon. It's also called a manifold learner because it kind of learns how to map a multivariate system into a lower dimensional space, right? So we do this separately for the size-related characteristics and the form-related characteristics. So we're able to reduce the amount of data from 60,000 data points to 12,000 data points for the size-related and 12,000 data points for the form-related characteristics. So we have now for each city and each point in time a 2-dimensional data point, right? So it's a coordinate. We have x and y. And what we can do now, we can map this in this 2-dimensional space, right? So for each city, we have x and y for each point in time. So we can connect the data points that belong to a specific city over time, starting in 1910, which is blue here, to dark red, which is 2010. And what we can do now, we can basically visualize these 60,000 data points in this visualization here, right? And this is quite interesting. So cities, with respect to size characteristics, move in this space from down here to up here. So they converge, they're getting closer to each other. Whereas if we look at form, we can see that cities evolve or travel through this two-dimensional space from down here to here, such as Boston, but other cities such as Kansas City, they move into this direction. So each region of this two-dimensional space has different underlying combinations of the input variables, which is shown here in these spider diagrams, right? So you can see here, for example, Kansas City in 2010 has a high level of scatteredness, right? Whereas, you know, cities located down here, such as Phoenix in 1910, has a high level of clusteredness, as an example. So the main observation here is that cities converge with respect to their size-related properties over time, whereas they diverge with respect to their form-related characteristics over time. So we observe convergence with respect to size, divergence with respect to form, or we can also say we observe a disentanglement or a decoupling of size and form over time. That's kind of the main finding of this study and of this paper. You can see the reference down here. So it's called a century of decoupling size and structure of urban spaces in the US. So, and this visualization is a core part of this publication. So again, we use TSNE as a dimensionality reduction method to visualize multivariate time series. Other people have done similar things. So TSNE itself is used in a lot of applications, but there are really just a few applications where time is explicitly incorporated in such an analysis. So yeah, this is what I've done in this study, and this visualization is made in Matplotlib, so in Python. There is really no like standard or default tool for this, so this needs to be coded manually in Matplotlib. Code for this is actually in my GitHub repository. I'll show the link in the end of the presentation. Yes, and we can go further. So each of these lines that we've just seen is actually represents a geographic object, right? A city. So each city has coordinates. So based on the location of the city, we can also regionalize this study. So we can stratify these plots by census division, for example, and we can see or analyze whether these trends that we see, whether they are, you know, somehow regionally dependent. And what we can actually observe is that the size-related trajectory, so this convergence effect is pretty universal across the whole conterminous US, whereas the form-related trajectories show more differences if we look at them separately for each census division, right? So you can see that, for example, South Atlantic versus mountain division, which is, you know, rather the West, show quite a different pattern here. So we can, the spatial or the geographic information that is contained in these data points by the location of the city, we can make use of this to kind of regionalize such a visualization, which is quite interesting. So yes, this is the second topic, and I think with this we get to the third topic for today, which is spatializing ternary plots, analyzing localized accuracy of remote sensing derived human settlement data. So what are ternary plots? Not sure how many of you know about this, but it's basically a graph that allows to plot three variables that sum up to a constant. So I just copy pasted this from Wikipedia. So it graphically depicts the ratios of three variables as positions in an equilateral triangle, which you can see to the right. So we have this example, the composition of a chemical substance consists of methane, nitrogen, and oxygen, and they always sum up to a constant, right? You can kind of visualize which composition of these three elements basically produce a flammable mixture. So you can depict this in this ternary plot. So yeah, a way to visualize three variables that sum up to a constant. This is the important thing to know here. And now I'd like to talk about how ternary plots can be applied in geographic information science. And one application is to use it in the context of accuracy assessment of land cover data. And I'd like to give a little bit of a broader overview on what that actually is. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the topic. So whenever somebody creates a data set such as land cover data, people are interested in how accurate this data product is, right? And a way to assess the accuracy of categorical spatial data such as land cover data is by using pixel-wise map comparison to a reference data set. So I've created this kind of schematic visualization here. So we have a categorical data set. It's not really land cover data, it's just a binary data set that distinguishes between developed and undeveloped land. So red pixels are developed areas, white are undeveloped areas. And this is the data we want to test, right? Then we have some reference data, sometimes called ground truth data, that comes from a different data source and presumably is of higher accuracy, right? So what we will get, or what we see, are differences between the two data sets, right? And we quantify these differences by establishing these agreement categories. So grid cells where both data sets agree are called true positives. And then we have grid cells that are only in our test data but not in the reference data. We call those false positives. And then grid cells that are missing in our data but available or labeled as developed in the reference data, such as this grid cell here, is a false negative, right? So we have true positives, we have false positives and false negatives. We also have true negatives, but which are the ones that are white in both data sets. We're not taking them into account here. So what people would do once we count basically the pixels in each of these three agreement categories, we can establish accuracy metrics such as precision, recall, or the F1 score, which is based on the counts of these grid cells in the three categories. There are more metrics such as the kappa index, overall accuracy, or percentage correctly classified. You'll probably learn about this or have learned about this already in some remote sensing class. So what we can do with these measures, we can kind of quantify the accuracy for our whole study area, right? But the problem is if you look at large data sets that cover different countries or different geographic regions, different geographic settings such as highly urban and rural areas, that accuracy actually varies across space, right? So accuracy is a spatially varying phenomenon. So we cannot just come up with one number that quantifies the accuracy for a whole country or study area, right? So what we need are actually so-called spatially explicit accuracy assessments that aim to quantify the accuracy at finer spatial scales. And one way to do this, and this is actually one of the strategies that I pursued as part of my dissertation work, also during my postdoc, is to use so-called focal windows, which are these black rectangles that we see here. So for each of these sub-regions of our study area, we will calculate the number of true positives, false negatives, and then ultimately come up with an accuracy measure for each of these focal windows. So we come up with a precision recall and F1 score for this window and for each of these windows. And we really do this in a convolutional manner. So we convolve this moving window across our whole study area. And this does not look very nice, but it just illustrates what we do. So we generate these statistics in a very spatially dense manner, which will actually or ultimately yield a continuous accuracy surface. Yes. So yeah, for each focal window, we have these three agreement categories and can calculate accuracy measures basically for each pixel. Okay, so now what we also should know is that so these three categories, true positive, false negative, they do not necessarily sum up to the same number, but we can normalize them. We can normalize them into the range 0 to 1, or as a percentage measure, right? And we are then able to locate each grid cell of our study area in a ternary plot, right? Because with each grid cell, we have associated the number of true positives, false positives, and false negatives as a percent measure based on the spatial neighborhood of each pixel, right? So we can visualize local accuracy measures in a ternary plot, and this is what we see here. And what I actually did was to compare a remote sensing derived data product, which is the global human settlement layer, against a reference database that we created based on cadastral data, which is called MTBF33, which stands for multi-temporal building footprint dataset 33, because it covers 33 US counties. So it's just a small dataset. So each dot in this ternary plot represents a pixel, so a location in geographic space, and the location of this data point in the ternary plot tells us how accurate this data, the global human settlement layer is at those locations. And not only that, but also about the kind of accuracy components, right? So whether we have a lot of agreement or disagreement in terms of missingness, so underestimation or overestimation, right? False negatives are associated with underestimation or omission errors, whereas false positives are associated with commission errors, so overestimation. Additionally, we can color code another spatial variable here. So the colors of the dots represent the built-up surface density, which is basically just the density of built-up grid cells in our reference data within each spatial neighborhood. So we have this fourth dimension basically encoded here by means of the color. And what you can see here, if you look at the highest high density settlements, which are these red and pink colors, they have a very high rate of true positives and almost no, close to zero, false negatives, and some around 25% of false positives. So the conclusion here, or what does it tell us? We see that in densely developed areas, the global human settlement layer is highly accurate, and the disagreement that exists consists of overestimation rather than underestimation. This is what we can see here. So yeah, again, we've kind of transformed two categorical spatial data sets into such a ternary plot by calculating the local agreement categories in moving windows, by converting them from absolute numbers into a percentage, and by visualizing these three complementary percentages in a ternary plot. And then we use another spatial variable for color encoding, right? So this is another interesting application, I think. And yeah, this is just to highlight what I just said, that in urban areas we see this kind of high level of agreement. Yeah. Okay, but now we can go even further. We can not only visualize this in a ternary plot, we can also spatialize these ternary plots. So right now it's an aspatial visualization, and this spatialization, so converting it into a spatial dimension or into a geographic space, is done by means of associating each of these three dimensions with a color channel, right? So true positives corresponds to the red channel, false positives to the green, and false negatives to the blue channel. So we have these numbers for each grid cell, right? So we can kind of generate a kind of a 3-band image, but the colors of this 3-band image do not represent RGB as it would be in a photography or in a scanned, photographic image, but the 3 channels represent these 3 agreement categories. And this is what we see here. So you can see built up areas. So black are built up areas here for the city of Worcester in Massachusetts. I think this is how you pronounce it, right? So I used to say Worcester, but somebody told me that it's wrong. So okay, so we have the reference data and we have this remote sensing data product, global human settlement layer, for 2 points in time. And then based on the method that I just explained, we can generate this focal accuracy composite, how we call it, where the colors kind of indicate the agreement and the type of disagreement that is predominant at each location, right? So we see the red areas, that means true positives are dominant, whereas blue means the global human settlement layer underestimates, so the false negatives are dominant, whereas green means false positives are dominant, so our data under test actually overestimate or are characterized by a commission error. So this is what this tells us. So we can really, generate these accuracy measures in localized focal windows, transform these agreement categories into percentages, and then visualize this using this RGB color encoding. I've seen similar plots based on 3 complementary land cover classes, for example. So it's quite an interesting visualization technique to use this RGB color encoding whenever you have 3 spatial variables that are complementary, so that sum up to a constant. So this is kind of the takeaway message here. Yeah, the same visualization here shown for the whole state of Massachusetts. So again, RGB color encoding allows to visualize the spatial variation of the proportions of 3 complementary spatial variables at the pixel or at a local spatial scale, right? So that's that. This is basically the third topic, and now the last topic. I think we will go through this rather quickly. I'll speak a little bit about data visualization from different research projects that I've been working on. So animated data visualization is definitely an effective way to visualize change, right? Animated visualizations or animated maps can be used basically for 4 cases: to visualize the change of magnitude over time within fixed spatial units, such as animated choropleth maps, or within grid cells. We can also look at growth or shrinkage of a spatial object over time, such as the growth of a city, right? Related to the persistence or the duration of geographic objects. So, of course, if we speak of shrinkage, objects such as built-up areas can also disappear. If we look at deforestation, for example, animated data visualization is effective also for visualizing movement paths. You can think of, like animal movement trajectories that are collected through these GPS sensors. Probably seen that. Or we can also think of aspatial, so non-geographically related animated data visualization. Changes of magnitude over time within fixed spatial units. As an example here, I don't want to go too much into detail, but what you can see here are basically areas that we generate for each census place in the US, and then we created a measure of remoteness for each place in the US that changes over time. It's a way to model the rural-urban continuum. We've done this in 10 years intervals since 1930, and you can see basically blue in this case are low levels of remoteness, so rather urban places, and you can see how this changes over time. We have these spatially consistent or almost consistent spatial units, and then the magnitude of each object, of each polygon basically changes over time. So this is an example to visualize the change of magnitude over time by such an animated choropleth map. Again, the color scale here may be debatable. I think this is the turbo color scheme, which was, I think, developed by Google. Yeah, maybe you can discuss this later on. Another example is changes of magnitude over time within fixed grid cells. So what you can see here is an animation that shows the change of average monthly temperature from the early 1900s. Of course, you can see nice spatial patterns here. Code for this is also available on my GitHub. Yeah. Then a second type of animated data visualization is to depict the growth and shrinkage of geographic or spatial objects over time. As an example here, this is actually the reference data that we used in the previously discussed accuracy assessment. So for each building, we have the construction date, and by just showing, the buildings that are built in each year or earlier, we can really nicely show how in this case, the city of Boulder has grown over time. So yeah, animated data visualization as a means to visualize growth. And in our case, we can do this at different spatial scales. This is at the building level, right? And then, we have this for Las Vegas here as well, which is also quite impressive. There was nothing in 1930, and then it grew very, very quickly. So this is at the building level. So we have a timestamp for each building footprint that is shown here. We can do it. We can visualize urban growth at the grid cell level, and we've already seen this earlier on in this presentation. So I don't want to show this again, but I'd like to emphasize that we can not only look at the size of a city in each year or visualizing the current state in each point in time, we can also visualize change. So we can visualize, for example, in this case, the newly built up areas within moving windows, right? Within, I think these are, what is that, 30 years? 30 years moving windows. So you can see the newly built up areas within moving windows. So which looks like fireworks. So it shows a different picture than what we've seen before, right? It's kind of a differential approach to look at city growth. So not looking at the absolute size in each point in time, but looking at the increase over time. Okay. And then another example of visualizing growth over time is this animation, which I did for different projects. So this is derived from metadata that is available for the USGS historical topographic map collection. So it basically shows us when and where historical topographic maps were created. So it shows us how the US was mapped basically by the land surveyors since 1890, I guess. What is interesting here is you can see, for example, if you look at the California region, that the mapping pattern, like they really went from north to south, as you in the kind of Sierra Nevada region, which is quite interesting. And then you can see since the 1980s, basically most of the country has been mapped, right? So another way to look at growth over time here, looking at mapped areas, long-term topographic mapping patterns. Okay, path movement. I don't have really data that fits to this topic, but what I want to point out here is that animated data visualization does not always have to have a temporal component. It can also have an ordinal component. And what do I mean by that? This relates to a different project that I've been working on, which is about estimating the importance of the US highway network. Basically, what we did for each of the around 3,000 counties, we calculated the shortest path along the US highway network from each county to each of the other counties, right? So we have 3,000 counties, so it's kind of a distance matrix, if you will, 3,000 times 3,000, right? So in total, around 9 million routing operations along the US highway network, or actually just the half of it, because it was not directional, so 4.5 million routing operations. And then we calculated how often each segment of the highway network has been used. And what you can see here are the road segments that are mostly used. So these are considered, from this point of view, the most important segments of the US highway network. And we have this animation that kind of builds up the US highway network, but not over time, but with respect to the importance of the road segments, right? So it's an animated data visualization, but it doesn't have a temporal component, right? So it's the importance of the roads here, right? So, and to the right it would be excluding interstates, and to the left it would be including the interstates. So it's a tool to kind of calculate or estimate the value of the US highway network for each segment, basically how important it is. But I think the takeaway message here is that dynamic or animated data visualization does not necessarily have to have a temporal component. It could be ordinal, as it is in this case, so based on the importance. Okay, and then lastly, aspatial animated data visualization. What do I mean by that? For example, this so-called bar chart race, and you've probably seen that. They were all over social media, on Twitter and Facebook a while ago. So it's basically a set of bar charts for different points in time, right? And what we show here is basically on the data that I've shown earlier. So we know the built-up area for each US metro area for each point in time, right? So we can generate such a bar chart race. And I think the interesting thing here, can we watch this again? Yes, is that by 1910, New York metro area was the largest one in terms of built-up area. And then you can see how Atlanta, which is this one here, actually moves to the top 10. I think it is top 15 that we see here. And then it really jumps up, and at some point it passes Chicago, and now in 1995 or 2000 it actually passes New York in terms of built-up area. So again, from a kind of visualization point of view, we have time, right, which is the temporal dimension here. We have geographic space encoded in form of the 4 census regions here. So we have some intuition of where these cities are located, and we have the magnitude, which would be the built-up area, and how that changes over time. And then we also depict the relationship between different cities, right? So kind of the ordinal relationship, which city is the largest, and how does that change over time, and to which region do these cities belong. So yeah, that's it basically. Let's watch this again to the end. Okay, yeah, so discussion, just to recap a little bit. So we've learned about several geovisualization techniques. We've seen these heat maps that encode COVID-19 cases over time and across the rural-urban continuum. We've seen how we can visualize multivariate time series using TSNE dimensionality reduction and these resulting feature spaces. We've looked at ternary plots and how we can apply ternary plots in the context of accuracy assessments, and then spatialize these ternary plots using RGB color encoding. And we've seen how we can use animated data visualization for several purposes, illustrating growth, change, and ordinal relationships. A few questions to discuss. Yeah, do you consider a bar chart race that shows cities actually aspatial? Because there is actually spatial and geographic information involved, just no geographic space, right? So you can incorporate space in a non-geographic visualization. We've seen this several times along this presentation, also in the first topic. And then I'd really like to want you guys to really critically look at the color schemes that I used. So some of them, I would not use them anymore if I did these figures now. There is this like trend that these kind of rainbow colors should not be used because you can't really, you don't have an intuition what is high and what is low, right? So why does yellow depict a higher value than green? It's kind of not clear. And then it would also be interesting to hear if you guys have any use cases for such visualization techniques for your own work, such as a semester project or your thesis. Okay, then here are a few resources. Okay, all the visualizations that you've seen, or most of them, were done in Python using a couple of different libraries. Data animation was also mostly done in Python. Some of them was done in Flourish, which is a web-based visualization tool. Then there is code for visualizations on my GitHub. I have a few more visualizations on my Twitter account and also on Figshare. And we have a YouTube channel for our historical settlement data. And here are a few references. You will get those slides as well. So you can look at the materials in more detail.